Sera? Sera, ok. Buonasera. If you can take seats, slowly but surely we'll start. Okay, very welcome to this event, a book event on Why Europe. That's the book that we present today. In collaboration with this institute, the Instituto Sturzo, and with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We're very pleased to have you here this evening. I must excuse our president of the institute, Nicola Antonetti, but we're very happy to have our panelists with us this evening. Nino Galetti from the Stiftung, Loredana Teodorescu from the Instituto Luigi Sturzo, and Steven van Hecke from the Catholic University of Leuven. And I will be your moderator today, and my name is Barbara Kahn, and I'm the chair of the new KU Leuven Alumni Chapter Italy. I will give the word now to Steven to present his book. I think that is what everybody would like to hear first and foremost, and then we'll start the debates with our three panelists this evening. I organized the event in 4 rounds this evening. That means that we will start with a couple questions that actually look back to the past. Then in the second round, we'll look into the current situation and where Europe finds itself today, and especially its role, the Italian role in the Union. We'll open up the discussion to the public in a third round, and then we'll finalize our discussion with some predictions towards the future. We'll try to finalize everything in 1 hour. I know it's a busy evening, but do know that we have refreshments for you at the end of the event. Welcome.
So as you can see, I will start. If Mr. Parenti appears, then I will interrupt my introduction and give him the floor. Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and a special welcome, of course, to the KU Leuven alumni this evening. Grazie per l'ospitalità. Thank you, Institut Luigi Sturzo, for having us, and also herzlichen Dank für die Zusammenarbeit mit der Konrad Adenauer Stiftung this evening. It's not my first time in the Institute, Loredana. I've been here before, and there is a certain reason. I will confess, I will do a confession. I have something with political buildings, with political venues. So here we have Luigi Sturzo. I think I started 20 years ago when I did my PhD about the European People's Party. I was in Röndorf, where Konrad Adenauer was buried. Very easy to lose your way there, but eventually I managed. I recalled it when I did my PhD defense. In the meantime, I'm invited to more fancy places like Cadenabia, Lago di Como. And even yesterday, after I visited the FAO here in Rome, on my way back to the Accademia Belgica, I could not resist of passing by the Palazzo dei Conservatori, where the treaties of Rome have been signed, as well as Piazza del Gesù, where the former headquarters were of the Democrazia Cristiana. There's still a plate that says that Alcide de Gasperi have founded the party there. The Rome treaties signed at the Roman capital, as well as Alcide de Gasperi, they are both mentioned in the book that we are presenting today. Next to the Messina Conference, of course, the famous case, if you have ever studied law, Costa versus Enel, Altiero Spinelli is there, the famous Milan European Council, not only because at that time the flag, the blue flag with the 12 stars and the hymn were officially recognized as symbols of the European integration, but also it was an important summit that later on became the Single European Act, so to launch the single market. Even Toto Cotugno is mentioned, thanks to his Insieme, so the song that won the Eurovision contest in 1992. There's also a reference to what has been recalled, at least in the Belgian press, the famous G20 summit in Cannes, France, in November 2011, when Silvio Berlusconi was like a little boy, punished by the big figures of that day, Obama, Cameron, Merkel, Sarkozy. 1 week later, he was succeeded by Mario Monti, and he never became Prime Minister of Italy again. Mentioned in the book, Mario Draghi, of course, as well as Romano Prodi and his famous saying, Germany, too small for the world, too big for Europe. There's much more, of course, in this book, organized for you under the title, Why Europe? An Integration History from Adenauer to Zelensky. Just a small advertisement, but you already have seen it. We have some copies here. I brought them on the plane to Rome. You can buy them for 30 euros, which is not much for 70 years of European integration history, but of course there's also a website. You can order it online too. What is the book? I will first tell you what it is not. It's not the first book about European integration history, of course. It's also not the first book about how the European Union works, of course. It might be the first that combines these two. So if you read from A to Z, you have the history, but at the same time, we try to explain you how the EU functions, how it works. I'm saying we because I wrote it together with the Flemish journalist Camille Vermeulen, who could not be here today in Rome. It's 6 questions linked to 6 periods and 6 core topics. And we even have the ambition with these 6 topics to cover everything that is important within the European integration process. Security, market integration, the role of the British Economic and Monetary Union, enlargement, and crisis management. It is initiated by a fund called Involve EU, which brings citizens closer to the EU, and it's written for a broad audience, originally published in Dutch. It starts with Adenauer's dream, that's the first quotation, and it ends with a quotation of Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in the Parliament, European Parliament in Brussels in February, inaugurated as a rock star. He did his speech in Ukrainian, but the last sentence was in English, and that's also the final quote in the book, care about the European way of life. Actually, with the war in Ukraine, a new phase starts in the European integration process. So what does the book do? It explains everything that happened before in order to understand how the EU functions today, why certain issues matter. So it's about the past, the present, and also the future, a bit the same as we will do later on this evening in the panel. Talk about the past, the present, and also the future. By the way, that was also a reference of the current European Parliament President Roberta Metsola when she landed, apparently in a Ryanair plane here in Rome to speak with the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. I'm happy later on also to join the panel debate. Barbara has already introduced the panelists, but first of all, before going to the panel, I would like to offer Mr. Parenti the floor to also make some introductory remarks. This evening, Mr. Parenti is the head of office of the representation of the European Commission in Italy. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Van Ecke. Thanks for the opportunity to give a few words, and sorry for being late. I think it's the culmination of heat and traffic in Rome, which is always difficult to beat. I need to be clear from the beginning. I only read the first 5 pages of this book. So I won't be able to make a presentation on the book, although already from the first pages, I think it's very clear that what Professor Vaneke does is to identify some of the very key questions we have to ask ourselves, especially are we getting into a very topical year for Europe, which is the year leading to the European election of next June. Why these questions are topical? The questions are topical because they go across a number of issues which are extremely divisive for Europe. Why don't we have an army? Why are we using the euro and maybe we cannot go back to our old habit of having the Italian lira and devaluate it when it's convenient for us? Why don't we have a foreign policy? Some of those, why the Brits have left the European Union. I still don't know if the answers to those questions are in the book, let alone if they would be correct from my own viewpoint. But I would imagine by talking to Professor Vaneke a couple of days ago for a few minutes that we'll be having very similar views on many points. I think a common thread, a common answer to some of these questions is that because Europe matters, but could matter much more if we were doing things together. So the answer doesn't necessarily mean that Europe must be a federalist union. It doesn't mean one football championship for the entire continent and one team playing and competing in the World Cup, but means doing things in a much more structured way together where we can offer the answers. And I think that the Brits are understanding in the hard way why Europe, in fact, was mattering to them beyond the remit of a delusional past or possibly the remit of ideas of regaining back control, which in the current world is possibly lost if you don't have a critical mass. So all of this comes back to, I think, a big dichotomy that has existed in Europe since the beginning between what Jean Monnet used to say, well, Europe will be made throughout crisis and the response to those crises, and what Altiero Spinelli used to say, which is the path is ahead of us is clear, is difficult, but we will have to walk along that path. And the path, of course, for him was the one of European integration. I think as of today, we may have to need that we have the need to move a little bit more away from Monnet into Spinelli, not to create a federalist union, but to create a union that can respond to the needs of the citizens. Because as the professor was recalling, and I think President Zelensky was rightly pointing out, if we need to care about our lifestyle, about what Europe is today, which is a hub for democracies and a democratic hub, a place where rule of law is respected and where rule of law is promoted, a place where social cohesion is cherished, social benefits are considered part of our society, that requires most likely, in front of increasing challenges that we have from abroad and in our very near abroad, then we need to give a more critical responses to all of this. Some of these responses will be difficult. Some of these responses will be complicated. They will not take place tomorrow. The future of Europe often is a matter which excites the people like those of us who are here in this room tonight, but not necessarily those in the street. And when they go to often to vote, they don't even have a knowledge of what they're voting for. But that future needs to be explained, needs to be understood, needs to be criticized if so it has to be. But to do so, we need to explain. And there, I think that the book of Professor Van Ecke, from what I started to read, starts to give some of these answers, or at least gives a lot of food for thought. And from this, I'm very grateful, and I would like to thank you, and thank you, Don Sturzo Institute, for inviting me here for these few words. And I'm again sorry, A, for being late, and B, for leaving very early. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio Parenti, for the welcome remarks. This actually brings us directly to our first round, if I may. And may I call you Nino Galetti? Nino, starting a book on the European integration history with Eisenhower, what does that actually mean? What is his role? What was his role then, and what is his legacy now?
So, good evening from my part, and first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to you to have come at this very warm evening. And I just want to make the remark that it's really a good book, and I don't tell you that because I'm sitting here now and we are on this book presentation, but it's really written in short chapters, and the language is not too heavy, and it's easy to understand. And so I will take it and will read it this summer because it's really nice. I already read some chapters, and for me it's quite interesting. Coming back to Adenauer, I'm honored that Stephen was starting his book by Adenauer, and I think it's not only because Adenauer begins with the A and Zelensky with the Z, that is nice, and you have to use this coincidence. But it's interesting that you started with Adenauer. You mentioned him in the beginning, because in the beginning was Adenauer. It was not only him, but there were also others like Alcide de Gasperi. We have to tell him to call him here in Italy, of course. But coming back to Adenauer, we must remember that for Konrad Adenauer, it was especially the two world wars that introduced him to the European idea. Adenauer was born in 1876. He witnessed also a long period of stability characterized by peace and prosperity, at least in the major Western countries, which were in this time also the great powers of the world. And until his 38th anniversary, he lived in a peaceful world. So, First World War started in 1914. He was 38 years old, and for him and for his generation, it was a heavy lesson to learn that this stability, that peace and prosperity, was not the normal state of affairs, but could be very fragile, and that the European states, after a long period of relative stability, found themselves in such a terrible war. He learned in this time, in this age, that West European states could lose all. And so his answers at the age of 40, 42, 45 was to build up European unity. I think that's very interesting, and I think for all of us it was also like a shock moment when war in Ukraine started and we realized that peace in Europe is not a normal state. You have to work for it. Adenauer was not immediately after the First World War adept to the European idea. First, he had to witness in 1939 then at the age of more than 60 years, and that Germany and German politics had once more started a terrible war. Over the years and decades, all this led to his conviction that European unification was the only guarantee of peace and prosperity in Europe. Western Europe, you have to say, because his idea of Europe was always centralized in the western part of Europe. And for him, it was clear that the differences between the European states would remain. But the way to handle with these differences had to be found, and the differences had to be bridged through negotiations and rather than over wars. And so, as Chancellor in the early 1950s, Konrad Adenauer was not strong enough to propose European unification. So it was the French foreign minister of this time, Robert Schuman, who took the first steps and proposed the communitization of coal and steel. And there were other European politicians, I already mentioned Alcide de Gasperi, who took up this proposal and developed it positively to European unification as we know it today. So those little words just to remember Konrad Adenauer and the time he was living. And for me, it's always interesting to see that up to the age of 38, he was living in a Europe that was functioning, but then the catastrophe came.
Thank you very much. And also mentioning the Gasperi, it actually brings me to Loredana. And my next question, how do you evaluate the role of the Italian politicians, and especially then the Christian Democrats, in the first decades of that integration process?
Barbara, and first of all, let me thank also on behalf of the President of Istituto Sturzo, Professor Nicola Antonetti, Stephen Vanecke, Professor Vanecke, for suggesting this timely discussion today, but also our partners of this initiative, so University of Leuven and Alumni Association and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. It's really great to be here, and let me congratulate you, Stephen, for this great book. I also read it. I really appreciated your effort to bring closer to the citizens the meaning and the history of Europe, and also this huge effort to retrace the history of Europe through leading figures, through leading questions, and through specific topics which are still on the table to be discussed today. And then, Barbara, going back to your question, of course, Italy, since the beginning, played an important role in the European integration process, especially being a founding country. Of course, it accompanied all the different stages of the European Union integration. And of course, I'm not an historian, and I don't have the ambition here to recall all the different stages, but I'd like maybe to mention, let's say, three main issues or figures. The first one, since we are here at Istituto Luigi Sturzo, let me recall you the vision and the message of Luigi Sturzo. Luigi Sturzo, of course, for a chronological reason, cannot be considered a founding father of the European Union, but nevertheless, he had already a strong idea of a united Europe, and already in the late 20s, he was talking about United States of Europe. His idea, this is what he wrote: the United States of Europe are not a utopistic vision, they are rather a long-term ideal goal with different phases and many heartless. He identified already at that time what was a necessity, which was limiting the national sovereignty, but what was also the challenge to create a European Union as such, and I would say that this is still a big challenge today. I remember three years ago we had this interesting discussion at the European Parliament with David Sassoli. He was at that time the president of the European Parliament, and we had a discussion about Sturzo, which was who was defined by everybody as a European man, so not a founding father, but European man who led the way towards this idea of European integration and contributed to this European identity in different ways, in a cultural way, from a political, institutional, religious point of view, so really from different points of view. And then, of course, after the Second World War, Italy played a huge role in the creation and in the development of this project, which, as Stephen recalls us, it's a process, it's an ongoing process, it's still developing. Of course, De Gasperi played a huge role, and this was related to the fact that he experienced the war, but he also experienced the dictatorship, an authoritarian regime. So he really looked at the European Union, at this project, as the only way to re-emerge from the tragedy of the Second World War and to make sure that this was not going to happen again. And this is really where his thoughts met those of Adenauer, of Schuman, of many other founding fathers who pushed forward this project. The idea here was really to create a Unite Europe for Peace and Democracy, and today we can say that this was really a vision, and their vision was right. In the end, through the European Union project, we managed to have decades of peace, and as Nino was mentioning, we somehow at some point took this for granted when we started questioning the meaning of the European Union today, taking for granted that already being a project of peace was and is a major success, a major outcome of what we established. Recalling De Gasperi, I would say, since Germany is somehow represented here, that he was called a mediator between Germany and France. So he had this huge responsibility of rebuild our own country, Italy, reposition Italy with the Western countries. But he was also advocating for Germany to be back at the table with the other European countries. And this was also because of the growing threats posed by the Soviet Union. And also with this spirit, he passionate advocate for the European defense community. Again, this is something that didn't happen, but it was already very, let's say, highlighting at the time. So if you think of what we didn't have or what we could have achieved with the European defense community. I mean, already at that early stage, a political community, already competencies such as foreign policy and defense shared among countries, already a sort of strategic autonomy of the European Union within the NATO alliance. So this is something that was there on the table, and De Gasperi advocated for it. It didn't happen, but today we are questioning what we lost at the time and how important would be today in face of the current challenges of the Ukrainian war to have and to rethink about such an important project. Finally, De Gasperi was an inspiring force behind the creation of the European Economic Community. Unfortunately, he died, so he didn't see this happen, but we know that it's very well known that he was behind this huge project, and Italy played an important role. And finally, since the end of the Second World War, let me remind you that, of course, the Europeanism was and is still the main pillar of our foreign policy, which means that Christian democracy, having such a leading role after the Second World War, played an important role also in this regard. So, for instance, here we are preserving the archives of Andreotti. Andreotti was 7 times the president of the Council of Ministers. Of course, he played a huge role after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for the Maastricht Treaty. So, of course, again, we cannot retrace the whole history, but I would say that Italy definitely played an important role for the European integration.
Loredana, I would also like to give the floor now to Stephen to comment on these answers. I think what I hear is that obviously a lot of the things that the personalities that have been spoken about have, lived crises. Certain political systems have had an immense impact on the results and the formation of the Union. And so I'm looking forward to hear your remarks, Stephen. Thank you.
Barbara? Okay, it's working. Thank you. Just a quick comment maybe before we go to the second round. I liked Nino's comment linking Adenauer with war, because we always used to think about him as a personality, of course, after the Second World War. but indeed I think it also made his personality and shaped his view about Europe. And Loredana linking Sturzo with dictatorship. We always think about something positive, but indeed there is also a kind of a negative side, which brings us to the very moment. I mean, from Adenauer to Zelensky, it has all been mentioned. We are today again in a state of war against a dictatorship, which pushes the EU to its limits, but also brings the essence of European integration to its core. The Dutch subtitle of the book is called From Peace Project to War in Ukraine, which is not a contradiction, it's a paradox, because both go together. That's also explained in the conclusion of the book, that in order to try to keep this peace project functioning, the EU had to go to war in order to defend Ukraine against the Russian aggression, etc. So thank you for these comments, bringing back or reminding the importance of war and dictatorship.
Thank you, Stephen. This brings me then to our second round. Let's look at what we are currently living. And Loredana, how would you then describe the role of Italy in this present EU? The role of Italy in the EU international politics, particularly then the war in Ukraine and its position. How are you looking to the present situation and the role of Italy in it?
So first of all, I think that Italy should still play, has still an important role to play. Let's just think that Italy is the third largest economy in the European Union after Germany and France, and is also the third most populated country, again after Germany and France. And let's recall again the role Italy played as a founding member of the European Union. But I think that today sometimes we are missing the opportunity to really shape the future of the European Union. And this is also related to the fact that after the First Republic in Italy, the political landscape is very volatile. We have a high turnover, a political fragmentation, many governments, almost one government per year. So of course it's more difficult to bring our own voice and to try to bring major changes, major leaps within the process. And probably this is also related to the fact that the Italian citizens lost a little bit the enthusiasm for the European Union. We witnessed this in the last decade, especially because of the crisis. So Italian citizens felt at some point the European Union was not delivering enough, and this created a sort of new wave of Euroscepticism. And I think that this also played a role in the sense that there was no more such an enthusiasm for the European project. Of course, this is changing at the moment, also because of the pandemic. So there we felt that the European Union was again there, was still delivering, and now the war in Ukraine, which changed, I think, the whole debate about Europe and the meaning of the European Union, the meaning of being all together. Now, since last autumn, we have a new government led by Meloni, the first female leading a government in Italy. We know that over the years she was pretty critical of the European Union as such, of European Union policies, of European Union federalism. But I would say that this changed a little bit already while she was campaigning, so already during the elections. So her main focus was really, her main objective was and is still to reassure everybody that Italy is part of the European Union, is part of the Western world, has a role to play. So what she's trying to combine is having a louder voice, so bringing a louder voice of Italy within the European Union while defending or protecting somehow the national interest. And this is how I would also somehow explain her vocal, let's say, support for Ukraine, which I think it was really important within the European Union because facing the challenge of the war, we refound somehow the unity within the European Union. Italy played a role because since the beginning, Meloni's government was absolute against Putin, supporting all the EU measures. Even there is a high price to pay for it, also in terms of, also for our own citizens. And so I think that this alignment of the Italian foreign policy with the EU position was, and it's still very important, and is not taken for granted because Ukraine is pretty far away from Italy, so it was not really on the, let's say, on the top agenda, on the priorities of our own foreign policy, but still we understood, all of us, even our citizens, even Italian citizens, that it's important to be there all together and to have and develop a common response. Then, if I look at the role Italy could play, especially when it comes to foreign policy, I think that we could definitely play an important role when it comes to migration policy. Migration has always been one of the priority in our foreign policy, and in the last years we've always tried to put this high also on the European agenda, and maybe we can talk about this later, but we recently had some important developments also within the Council, which means that Italy is somehow delivering on that, or at least is managing to push forward the migration dossier. Then the Mediterranean region. Of course, now the whole attention is focused on the eastern side and what happens on Ukraine, but for a country like Italy, but also for other Mediterranean countries, what happens in the whole region is really essential. The Mediterranean region is still facing increasing challenges, also related to the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and here I mean food security, for instance, but then we have instability, crisis, Tunisia, Egypt, and many other countries with consequences for us in terms of migration, but also with unpredicted consequences in terms of instability, social tensions, etc. So that's why it's really important to refocus also on what happens there on the other side of the Mediterranean region. And here Italy has a role to play to bring the attention on also on the southern side of Europe. And then another dossier where Italy also played an important role in the past, and I think should also play a role now, it's the enlargement policy. I mean, we have the Balkans just here across the Adriatic Sea, and it's something where the Minister Tajani is trying to to push a little bit the agenda, saying that the Balkans cannot wait any longer. So I think that Italy has a role to play also in this regard, pushing forward the enlargement process and also trying to take into consideration all the consequences of the enlargement process, which we know it's not, let's say, that easy. So it means that we also need to rethink our own internal policies and to be realistic in terms of promises, etc. When it comes to challenges, so how we can manage this, how we can play a role, I think that a lot depends on how Meloni will be able to recreate alliances, strong alliances within the European Union with other countries, and to affirm herself as a reliable partner. I think that this is really the way forward. And in this sense, I see as a positive outcome the visit yesterday of the President Meloni with the meeting between President Meloni and President Macron, because the idea is really to recreate the alliances, and this can help us to bring to the European tables issues which are important also for our own foreign policy agenda.
Thank you, Loredana. I think it's challenging maybe to follow up with my next question, because I'm trying to see if you can, maybe compare Monti Draghi's period with what Meloni is doing right now, and if we are leaving the traditional pro-European integration attitudes with this current government, or do you see this differently? And is Italy a forerunner maybe for the other member states and other member states that are waiting to maybe come into the Union? What is your vision on how she plays a role in the present situation?
Well, I think, well, as an observer of Italian politics, many of us were afraid 1 year ago when the election was postponed. And because it was clear that Meloni would be very strong, and it was a possibility that she would become president of the government. The only thing we knew about Meloni was this angry woman, and angry and aggressive woman we know from the telegiornale. Because many of us, the correspondents, the diplomats, also other observers like me, we had a lot to do with other politicians in Italy, like the Five Star Movement, like the Lega, like all the others, like Matteo Renzi, and they gave us a lot to do and a lot to observe. So up to 1 year ago, Giorgia Meloni was leader of a very small party who had last time, I think, 4% in the parliament elections, and who had less than 20 senators and deputies in the parliament chambers. So for us, she was becoming very important, and only 1 year ago, it was in June 2023, Giorgia Meloni made this famous speech in Spain. I think it was an election campaign, and it was the partner party of Fratelli, Vox, where she made a very aggressive speech, and I know that many correspondents, many diplomats were once more shocked by her. Well, now she changed, as Loredana mentioned already, and since she has become president, she's doing kind of bella figura, how we call it here in Italy, and we can observe that she has really become like a very smoothful politician. And if we observe some politic fields like foreign politics, like transatlantic relations, also like the Russian-Ukraine war, and we have to submit that she is absolutely not an extremist, but she is doing European politics. And from our point of view, that's a very good thing. And if we observe the European politics, the budget politics, economic politics of Italy under her government, we can also submit that she's doing very slight politic. And I read that some journalists in Italy already call her Draghi bis, so the second government of Draghi without Draghi. So obviously she knows how to defer between doing opposition and doing governing. For me personally, that was a surprise, because she never governed a country or a region. Her experience as minister is quite short, and it makes a little time that she was Minister for Youth. But she is managing the government, and she's doing it so that I personally can't criticize her fundamentally. Her aim is to give Italy really a voice, and I think that's the weakness of Italian politics. So just to remember you, our Chancellor, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she faced 8 prime ministers of Italy, starting with Silvio Berlusconi and going up to Mario Draghi. And so for Italy, I think it's a disadvantage to have so many changing governments and so often a changement of government, because it's really hard to follow up some projects of Italy, of Italian politics. And that's the big weakness. And I think Giorgia Meloni is just working on this. She's giving Italy a voice, and I observe that many foreign politicians and foreign journalists also come towards us and are asking, so what is she doing? And explain us, because they give her a certain importance.
Stephen, after the comments of Loredana and Nino, I wonder how you feel about the current position of Italy, and especially then the figure of Meloni. Do you still sense the discrepancy between who she was before and who she is now as a stateswoman? And what do you think? What's her goal?
Agree with what Nino said. I mean, she did a dramatic change from opposition to the government, but also vis-à-vis the European Union. And there is a clear explanation for that. She cannot be a successful Italian prime minister while at the same time starting battles with Brussels. She needs the support of the Commission. She needs the money of the EU. That is quite clear. So that means that she's a smart politician, that she understood. Like Margaret Thatcher once said, choose your battles. It's quite clear in which area she allows a lot of public discussion and a lot of fuss, but in other areas it's clearly covered. You can already see it in a way with how she managed to distribute ministerial portfolios. From the very first moment, she wants to give a positive signal to Brussels. And that already reassured a lot of people in the Brussels bubble. Adding to what Loredana said, we have been discussing Italian politics from the point of view of politicians, of us, the people who observe, watch, who love the small details, the gossips. Something else is the public opinion. There you have seen in Western Europe a kind of disappointment with Italy being the founding member state and becoming Eurosceptic every new election. The turning point, I think, it's a small anecdote, was this famous video, it's also in the book, of David Sassoli in front of, I think it were white Dutch talibs, asking the audience, Dutch people and the others, who will buy your products if you let us down again? And this was the sentiment here in Italy. Italy being left down during the Euro crisis and being left down during the migration crisis. And I think also pointing to the crucial role of Angela Merkel, she understood very well we cannot afford us to do it 3 times. And therefore the response during the COVID crisis, of course, we all were shocked in Western Europe by the pictures and the footage of the hospitals in Bergamo. I'm sorry to say it was not a hospital in the south of Italy. It were hospitals in the north of Italy. So that shocked the public opinion of Western Europe. And I think was really kind of a changing moment, that also there was a large support among the European Union. This is Italy, we need to help them, and that allowed leaders also to jump in and to make a clear signal. Contrary to the Euro crisis and to the migration crisis, we have to act quickly to keep Italy and the Italian public opinion on board. And actually they succeeded. And we still see it. If Meloni is not able to fight Brussels, it's because of the Next Generation EU, of the resilience and a recovery fund that brings once more Italy, but also the other member states together. Thank you.
For your remarks. I actually would like to open up the floor to the audience before we go into round 4, speaking about the future. So please raise your hands and we'll take questions for our panelists. Thank you. If you can stand up, just say your name, your affiliation, and then the question. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Federico Sturzo, and I'm a student from Lewis University. And I had a question because before one of you said that Mr. Antonio Tajani said there's no time to wait for Balkan states to join in EU. I was thinking, I've studied the case of Serbia, for example. Are we really sure that all this rush in trying to include new members inside the European Union is something good for us, or are we going to have a new Hungary or a new Poland that sometimes is very hard to deal with inside the EU policies?
Thank you. Is there somebody who wants to take that question? Yeah, Steve.
But I'm happy to answer it. Today, the Friends of the Western Balkans have been launched by Austria, if I'm not mistaken, and Italy is even part of it. First of all, we thought, the attention is now to Ukraine. Those who will pay the price will be the countries of the Western Balkans. Rather the opposite turned out. There is a kind of a new wave going on. I think the EU learns its lesson with, among others, Hungary and Poland. So there will be more tough on the criteria, and also the EU is, of course, trying to catch up. Once you're a member, you're not having a blanco check anymore, so the EU is slowly, maybe a bit late, but still trying to adapt its policies, so that is reassuring. I understand that in the Western public opinion, there is no appetite for an enlargement these days. For instance, in Belgium, if you want to lose the electoral vote, you just say that you're in favor of an enlargement with Montenegro and Serbia and maybe Ukraine. So it's not popular. But I think it's essential. Sometimes it's a bit decadent from our point of view to say, we are in, sorry, this is your problem, especially vis-à-vis the Western Balkans. If the EU wants to be a geopolitical player, let's start in your own backyard. Otherwise, it will be China, it will be Turkey, it will be the Gulf plates, and maybe Russia again. Secondly, a humanitarian. What kind of offer do we have for the young generations in these countries? If we don't have a clear perspective whether they will join the EU, they will leave their countries anyway. So the brain drain is ongoing. And then you get these countries in a kind of a negative cycle that will even be more difficult. If you're not convinced by the geopolitical or the humanitarian argumentation, think of your own self-interest. What banks, what construction companies, what private firms will profit from the internal market extended to the Western Balkans? You rather see an Italian bank in Sarajevo than a Bosnian bank in Rome in 10 or 15 years. So it's also to the benefit of the Italian and all the other economies.
This is also related to the consequence of the Ukrainian war. We are looking at the enlargement policy again as a geopolitical tool, which is important to bring stability, peace and security in our own backyard. So of course we need to be realistic, and we need to be careful about criteria, etc. But at the same time, the risk is to lose the whole region, and there is also a risk to create the frustration in all those people waiting to join us. So we should be realistic, but let's not forget about what we started as a process. And then talking about backyard and neighborhood, let me remind you again, talking about the role of Italy, that was Romano Prodi who started and launched the European neighborhood policy, because he had this idea of looking at what happens in the neighborhood and creating some privileged relations with our neighborhood, which today we understand it's really essential also for our own interest.
Yeah, please. Considering the time, I think we will take one more question after your question. Thank you.
Marco D'Agostini del Centro Studi Popolari Europei. Thank you very much for this meeting and for the book. On the one hand, the effects of the climate change show us the risk of the environment. On the other hand, we have Pope Francis, who says us we are not in a time of change, we are in a change of time, change of age. And he indicates, it's an indication for social, not only environmental, but social and human sustainability and the human ecology. Do you think that in the list of reasons to answer why Europe, could we insert also the capability of Europe to show to the world a new model of development, looking at the possibility not only in terms of current monetary and economic policy, but also in terms of institutional changes to have different economic governance and more attention for sustainability together with the stability. Thank you very much.
What do you think about the fact that we might be also forerunners thinking about the profit for the planet and maybe changing up also economically our ways of, how we deal with the issues of today? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I will link Adenauer to the current state of play. In a way, how Adenauer designed our societies, social market economy, European integration, transatlantic cooperation, is still more or less the building blocks of how we organize the EU today. And is still also a point of attraction for non-EU member states. That's also why they want to join, not because it's only a market, not because it's only a stability, it's a combination. So I think, different from NATO, for instance, the EU offers a full program, a full menu, so to say. And that links indeed stability, governance, social market economy, a relatively high level of welfare protection, social and environmental protection. The challenge is to try to make this model as sustainable given the enormous challenges, and indeed climate change is one of them. It's also discussed in the book as one of the crises. But at the same time, try to be also more appealing towards the current EU member states. There is not an issue that the EU is probably much more popular outside than inside the EU. I'm not talking about the rest of the world, that's another issue, but at least for the candidate member states, it's still a very attractive model. The real challenge for us is, I think, to explain also to our citizens what are the benefits, why we should not only be critical, but also should be, in a way, should see the advantages of the European integration project. And it also certainly applies to climate change. It's another example of that individual member states cannot do anything in the current world. If we are able to do something, then we'll have to do it together. And if we do it together, we can also be a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. These are big words, but I think this is the case. Also, other parts of the world are looking at the EU to take leadership, also in issues like climate change. This is what we need to invest even more, and this is also what we need to keep on explaining to our own audiences. Thank you.
Time for one more question, and otherwise I would like to, yes, yeah, they were both at the same time, please. Yeah.
My name is Arnold Mertens. I'm an alumnus of the Leuven University. I was looking at the title of the book and thinking about myself. I'm from Belgium. I've been living and working in Italy for 20 years. Until 15 to 20 years ago, there was probably no need to write such a book, in the sense when I grew up and when I was in high school, we did this thing called European classes with other high schools. When we visited the Brussels EU offices, it was all thrilling. I did an Erasmus. I spent years at the European University Institute in Florence. I found my wife there, who's not Belgian, etc., etc. So my question is, where did it go wrong? In the sense that even when I was at the EUI, there was absolutely no the kind of discourse that we're doing now, that it's an uphill battle. We need to convince the EU citizens about how useful the EU is, and so on. So, and that all that now it changed, and it always seems to me now that it's a fight that's very hard to win. So I'm wondering if there's something particular, very specific that it's sort of a tipping point, or if it's a kind of a sliding evolution, and how hopeful you are about this.
The question.
difficult question. I think it's a more general trend. You could equally apply it to American politics. Why did it go down? Brazilian politics. Why is everyone so unhappy about domestic politics? So it's a general phenomenon in the last 10, 20 years, I would say. This means that you should not necessarily expect the answer from the EU only. This would not be fair. Why would the EU be able to solve all these problems? Of course, this is not to say that the EU should not do its part. And that is why the book is there, to also try to explain a bit better what is going on, because it's complex. No one ever said it's easy. No one ever said this is going to be paradise on earth. There will always be problems, issues. So you need to explain. And that also needs education, and it also needs an effort. I'm not going to blame you because you are here, which is fine. But what about the other audiences? People take these days a lot of things for granted. That also includes the EU, unfortunately. When there is a crisis, all of the people, suddenly lots of people say, okay, maybe it's not that bad after all. Trying to answer these questions, trying to fill this gap is the mission of the fund and also of the book. There is certainly more need, because even if everybody would happy, there are always new generations. Young people will have to go for voting for the first time next year. So education is never finished. And also, once more, making a reference to the ongoing war, the way we have organized the EU, the way our democracies function, it's very clear that the job is never finished. So therefore, we should keep on doing these efforts.
Looking at the hour, I'm happy to take other questions, but I think I will first go on with the fourth round and then see if we have still the remaining questions from the audience. Looking towards the future, making some predictions. Nino, what will happen with Forza Italia, the current government in the post-Berlusconi era? What's your take on this?
That's not an easy question, but it's a quite interesting question. Well, I think the death of Silvio Berlusconi was a deep cut, because he was the founding president. He was, until the last second, inspiring for politicians of Forza Italia, and of course he was financing the party. We don't have to forget this also. So how will this heritage be maintained, and who will maintain it? I think the party now, a few days after his death, has shown that they want to have tranquility, and that for the meanwhile, Antonio Tajani will be the leading president, and after the summer we will see further.
It's indeed difficult to say, but Loredana, will Meloni manage to Italianize, you think, the EU, especially migration? You already mentioned. Yeah, maybe their position also towards the alliance, towards the Balkan region. Yeah, what's your take on what is going to happen, to your opinion?
Migration plays an important role, again, because it has always been a crucial topic for the Italian foreign policy. And there's a huge dilemma there for President Meloni. On one side, she needs to deliver on what she promised, but on the other side, she needs also to keep this kind of new alliances, so she needs to find a good compromise with the other countries. And in this regard, I think that the most recent Justice and Home Affairs Council was an historic one, because after years of failed attempts to find a compromise on solidarity, sharing responsibility on migration, finally the Council took some important decisions. Especially concerning solidarity. Italy has always asked for more solidarity in terms of migration, and finally at the Council the ministers agreed on a new kind of solidarity which is mandatory, good for us, but flexible in the sense that member states can still choose how to show this kind of solidarity. It's still not the, let's say, the best scenario. It's not exactly what Italy was looking for, but at the same time, I think that we need to find a compromise between the different countries, especially on such a sensitive topic. So there is room for improvement, but still it was really a positive outcome and a success also for Italy. At the same time, again, looking at the future, I think that a lot depends on how, as I was saying, how the president is going to recreate alliances. So before she was, let's say, her main friends were Hungary and Poland, and we know that on some issues, such as migration, we don't have, let's say, a common ground. So, of course, it's important to recreate the alliances and the relationships with other countries. A lot depends on internal domestic politics. I mean, how she will be able to keep the coalition together. And here, the death of Berlusconi also is an important issue. And then also, I think it depends on her proactive role. I mean, now she's reassuring everybody that Italy can abide by the rules, but this is not enough. We also need to be proactive and to come up with, creative solutions and positive solutions, not just criticizing what is not working or just saying what we want. We also need to show a little bit the way to achieve what we want.
Stephen, have you learned something this evening about Italy and the EU? Something new you want to share with the audience? And do you agree also with the predictions? Or do you see other things also moving into the future?
Yes, I certainly learned something that peut-être la prochaine fois on va dérouler ce débat en français. No, just 3 take-home messages, because sadly, Katelijne de Nys had to leave, so the Deputy First Secretary of the Belgian Embassy here in Rome. Not that I want to have the final word, but still, never underestimate a university, a professor, they always want to talk. No, first 3 take-home messages. First, once more, Ukraine. Why have the member states been so successful, divided on all kinds of issues? Why have they been so successful in aligning? Why does the support among the public opinion last so long, even after 1 year? Of course, it went down. What did you expect? But still, it's still very strong. I think there is, among the political class and also among the public opinion level, a clear understanding of what is at stake. With the war in Ukraine, everything comes together. It's the fight about the way how we have organized our lives, politically, socially, economically, and this is at stake. Do we want it to survive, and do we also want it to grant to those who freely want to join us and do not want to be part in another model in which they have no say? So everything comes together that was started 70 years ago by Adenauer and the other founding member states. This is what is really at stake. Will this model be able to continue or not? The second take-home message is thank you also for the colleagues here at the table, Nino and Loredana, for the nice comments on the book. You didn't have to, but I'm very happy that you did. Third take-home message, enjoy the reading of the book. Thank you.
And now please join us for an downstairs so we can continue the discussion in a more informal way. Thank you.